We covered in a previous video the efforts undertaken by a firm called GHF, or the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, to facilitate the delivery of aid to the Gaza Strip after Israel's embargo that started around March of this year. We also discussed the various contracting firms that are working in tandem with GHF to provide logistical and security support, and these are basically PMCs, or private military companies. The Wall Street Journal, recently published a piece describing elements within a US-based consulting firm that has been working with GHF. Initially, they were working on the humanitarian aid agenda, but then they began modeling relocation plans for Palestinians in the Gaza Strip. And if you remember, months ago when Netanyahu came to the White House and he was having an Oval Office meeting with President Trump, this whole turning the Gaza Strip into the Riviera of the Middle East and relocating the Palestinians was the topic of discussion. So getting into the article, this firm, the Boston Consulting Group, it's a corporate advisory firm, and they saw two senior partners step down from their leadership roles over their connection to work that went beyond the scope of the firm's initial efforts to assist in aid efforts in the Gaza Strip. Now, the firm got involved last fall in an effort that's been widely criticized as an Israeli-backed aid distribution initiative. And the reason that this effort's been widely criticized is because it basically takes the UN out of the picture. UN was initially responsible for providing aid and logistical support within the Gaza Strip. And the Israelis and the US were very uncomfortable about the UN facilitating these efforts because there were accusations that these UN aid groups were actually aiding and abetting Hamas. And so with this new effort, you have the UN out of the picture. And that's one of the reasons that it's being highly criticized. The Gaza work has spiraled into the most significant crisis. And one of the reasons that you see a crisis right now is because of the death toll amongst the Palestinians after these aid initiatives have taken place. Over 500 in the past month alone at the sites where food is supposed to be gathered and on the routes that the Palestinians are supposed to travel to the aid distribution sites. Now, long-term clients of BCG are expressing outrage at these revelations. Employees at BCG alumni are asking how one of the best-known corporate advisory firms got involved in Gaza in the first place. Now, the project began as a pro bono effort to help solve the food supply challenges in Gaza. The firm said it turned into an unauthorized project by two other partners against the firm's instructions. That work included post-war financial modeling to voluntarily relocate the Palestinians. In the latest leadership shuffle, BCG's chief risk officer, Adam Farber, and the head of its social impact practice, Rich Hutchinson, are stepping down from those roles but remain as senior partners. According to people familiar with the matter, both were aware of the early phases of the work, but not all the details. Now, these moves follow the June firing of two partners, Matt Schluter and Ryan Ordway. Schluter and Ordway had worked in BCG's public sector defense and security practice before being ousted. In late 2024, a partner at BCG misrepresented pro bono work. Months later, he began a paid phase of work without authorization, and in parallel, he and another partner undertook off-the-books modeling on Gaza reconstruction scenarios, and this was directly against BCG's instructions, and this is from a member of the firm. BCG added that it immediately stopped the work once it became aware of it, that it wasn't getting paid for any of it. The consulting firm's efforts in Gaza began in October. BCG signed on to help develop a feasibility study to establish a new aid organization in Gaza, which is the GHF. Now, BCG was contracted by Orbis Operations, and that's a Washington-based security firm owned by private equity firm McNally Capital. Orbis is made up of Central Intelligence Agency agents and other counterterrorism officials. So you have this consulting firm, and they signed on to help to help facilitate these feasibility studies to establish the aid organization GHF. And they were contracted by Orbis, and Orbis is basically run by the CIA and then various intelligence and counterterrorism officials. Now, the efforts led to the creation, again, of GHF, and this was conceived of and backed by Israeli and U.S. intelligence, as we just saw. And just want to make the point that this is all an effort to facilitate this sort of multinational presence in the Gaza Strip prior to what's likely going to be the removal of the Palestinian element from the Gaza Strip. In March, BCG's work turned into a paid engagement working on behalf of McNally Capital to help a private logistics and operations provider, Safe Reach Solutions. And we discussed Safe Reach Solutions and the other security and logistics firm, or PMC, UG Solutions, in a previous video. So we'll do a refresher on these two firms that have been contracted on behalf of the GHF. So SRS, or Safe Reach Solutions, which was only publicly launched in January of 2025, drafted operational plans for the Netzarim corridor between North and South Gaza. And if you remember, that's that corridor that bisects the Gaza Strip. It's basically a security parameter that bisects the north and the south of Gaza, and it's manned by the IDF. Details surrounding its founding and funding, SRS, remain opaque, though previous reporting from Jack Polson indicated it is a shell company for Wyoming-based wealth management firm Two Ocean Trust LLC. The Trump administration has been virtually silent on the development of mercenaries tied to UG Solutions and SRS to Gaza. First helped secure checkpoints in Gaza as part of a multinational consortium in February, and more recently to provide perimeter security for U.S.-based Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, serving as the primary channel for food and aid. And so, of course, the administration isn't going to say much about this because, again, it's kind of like a covert effort to seed these organizations and personnel into the Gaza Strip, preempting the remaking of the Gaza Strip without the Palestinians. The AP reported last week that two of the U.S. contractors from Safe Reach Solutions came forward as whistleblowers under the condition of anonymity and accused colleagues of shooting into crowds with live ammo, grenades, and pepper spray. And this has been a contentious issue over the past couple of weeks and months since GHF has taken over the humanitarian aid component in the Gaza Strip. The idea that there have been hundreds of killings of Palestinians, and the argument is basically that, the IDF isn't taking the blame. They're blaming Hamas. They're saying that seeded through the crowds. And of course, many in the Palestinian civil services are blaming the IDF. They're blaming these PMCs. And so it's been really messy. A lot of shootings and killings have taken place at the aid sites, at the routes that lead to the aid sites. And so that's one of the reasons, again, it's been such a controversial effort so far. Now, over time, the two partners did work that went beyond what BCG had approved. Like we were just talking about, that included developing post-war financial modeling to determine the cost of relocating Palestinians out of the Gaza Strip. McNally had no role in the post-war planning work, according to one person familiar with the situation. And of course, consulting firms sometimes join with humanitarian agencies working in the Middle East to provide pro bono projects. And so you have these consulting firms. It's not uncommon for them to work with humanitarian agencies to, distribute aid in war-torn areas. And in this case, the consulting firms have ties to different foundations that also have ties to our intelligence services, right? And so again, all of this kind of feeds into the bigger picture of basically reshaping the Gaza Strip something that Trump and that Netanyahu and elements within his government have been wanting to do for a while now. And we have to ask ourselves also, is this kind of force projection that we're seeing right now in the Gaza Strip with these PMCs going to be something that's normal now, right? Is it going to be something that's encouraged quietly by the Trump administration? Because like we've talked about before, it's also happening in Congo with Eric Prince and the groups that the PMCs that he's affiliated with. And they're working in the eastern part of Congo to try to secure and provide security and logistics for the eastern part of Congo where all the minerals are. About a week ago, the Trump administration signed a ceasefire or a peace between Rwanda and Congo. And of course, what he's trying to do is mineral extraction from the eastern part of Congo. And these PMCs are likely central to that effort of, again, securing those minerals. And so I was wondering, maybe this is going to be sort of the way the force projection posture that the Trump administration will be embarking on moving forward in these hotspots around the Middle East and in Africa and these places. And this is a little bit more on the issue of PMCs from the American conservative. And we're seeing the war privatization trend, which exploded during post 9/11 conflicts in Afghanistan, Iraq, and North Africa. And it's metastasized and morphed into a situation in which mercenaries are used as an extension of the U.S. government to provide directly advance a foreign nation's war policy. And so a lot of people consider, new wars as boots on the ground. They kind of take the idea of new wars to a radical conclusion that has to involve, air power, naval power, and boots on the ground. But I think that what we're seeing right now is Trump waging a very different, covert kind of force projection or warfare around the world with these PMCs. And Western media and analysts have maligned Russia and their state-funded private military company, the Wagner Group, for fighting on behalf of, but not officially, for Moscow in Syria, Ukraine, and Africa. If you remember, the Wagner Group run by Yevgeny Prigozhin, or what they called Vladimir Putin's chef, because he ran a culinary company, a catering business. And he was also the head of the Wagner Group. And if you remember the big battle that took place over the large Ukrainian city of Bakhmut, that was the Wagner Group that took that city. Months-long bloody battle. And so maybe Trump wants his own Wagner Group, right? Without saying it outright. Now it's become clear that American companies like UG Solutions and SafeReach, run and staffed by U.S. military and CIA personnel, may be smaller than Wagner, but are similar in organization. While there's currently no overt federal funding trail to these contractors, there's no trail that we know of, at least, both of which appear to have sprung into existence recently. The State Department rushed $30 million in USAID funds to GHF in the last month, waiving audits to do it. And I don't know how the money trails work. I don't know, perhaps GHF is in some way or another facilitating the funding of these PMCs that are operating in the Gaza Strip, right? And so that would effectively kind of make us involved in this war in the Gaza Strip. So the selling point, Trump doesn't have to put boots on the ground, right? So in these hot spots, right, where there's open warfare and conflict going on, most people are saying, well, we're not involved. There's no boots on the ground. He's not getting us into another war. It's like, well, depends on how you look at it, right? He can claim there are no boots on the ground officially, but then you've got these sort of covert operations going on. And this isn't the first time they've happened and they've been going on, but I'm just saying it's basically a broken promise. No new wars, but we're involved in the Gaza Strip. Now we have military personnel, whether they're on or off the books, operating in the Gaza Strip. I mean, so what's going on? Rather, he just farms out assistance to further the Israeli government's plan for Gaza, which, according to reports this week, is to continue to make the rest of the Strip uninhabitable while shifting hundreds of thousands of Haftar's homeless Gazans into a giant camp called the Humanitarian City. And we'll touch on that in a minute. And then that's going to be built on the ruins of Rafah in the south. And the Palestinians will next have a free choice to migrate out of Gaza once they go to this humanitarian city. And that's from Prime Minister Netanyahu. In the 1930s, there were also roundups and removal of entire groups of people into ghettos. And I think we know what we're talking about here. So having Americans manning checkpoints in the inner ring of the GHF puts a multinational face on what is essentially an IDF operation. And that's what they've wanted. They want a multinational face on this operation, this overarching operation of removal and rebuilding the Gaza Strip Palestinian free. So is this the start of what Trump described in his Oval Office proposal to Bibi? Article goes on, Josh Paul, a former military affairs official in the State Department who resigned his post in 2023 in protest of Biden's policies of transferring weapons to Israel, told the American Conservative that the U.S. contractors in Israel, like all hired guns, allow a degree of separation, and they do not imply U.S. national involvement. Still, Paul says it is clear they are there with U.S. approval and deep complicity in what is taking place at these aid centers, including the deaths of hundreds of civilians. He says this feels like a huge step in private military contracting. It was one thing to work under the State Department, but it is a whole different thing to work for a foreign government entity in a foreign land in active combat. Now, these mercenaries, this is a question that I was thinking and that I jotted down. If these mercenaries are willing to do this work on behalf of another country in their country, would they be willing to do this work anywhere else? And of course, the answer is yes, right? Are these organizations working in Ukraine, for example? And I think that's kind of far-fetched, but you kind of get the idea. We're seeing this take place in Africa. We're seeing it in the Gaza Strip. And the attention just doesn't seem to be there, right? It is complicated. There are a lot of different strings you could be pulling on, but it is something that should certainly be public and discussed more openly. Now, of course, American PMCs have been working across the globe for decades now to help fragile governments raise and train armies engaged in humanitarian rescue missions. Though we are not quite there yet, Jennifer Kavanaugh says, the trend that we are observing seems to be moving toward the outsourcing of certain types of military activities and operations to private companies, often staffed with veterans, to get around rules and limits placed on the use of U.S. military forces. Gaza is the next iteration of this. The rules and limits are indeed fuzzier for contractors. They are working ostensibly for the GHF. And like we talked about with the USAID funding, that's going to GHF, right? And if these organizations like SRS and UG Solutions are working under the GHF, then you can only assume that that's likely where those funds from USAID, it's not USAID anymore. It's just wrapped up into the State Department, which is even worse. So if these State Department funds are going to GHF and GHF is funding these PMCs, then you can see, again, this is kind of just an outgrowth of what Trump was talking about, turning Gaza into the Riviera of the Middle East. They are ostensibly working for the GHF, not the American government. What is the chain of command on the ground? Well, it says the biggest risk, setting aside civilians getting killed, is that the contractors come under attack and Washington, in reaction, deepens its involvement, right? Now, I'm pretty optimistic on that. I don't know that we're going to see anything like that, because if an American is killed or any member of these private military companies are killed, it's likely not going to get the that kind of explosive coverage in the U.S. media, for obvious reasons, because they want to tie these boots on the ground, which is what they are, back to the Trump administration. And so I want to touch a little bit on this humanitarian city, just very briefly. And this was a plan that was announced by Defense Minister Israel Katz last week, and it would force up to 600,000 people into a strip of land where Rafah once stood, then lock them in or allow one-way immigration abroad. You can either stay, clustered in this basically desolate area that was bombed and that was basically destroyed with no infrastructure, utilities, right? Completely dangerous. Or you can go to Egypt, basically. I don't think that they're going to be, the IDF or the Israeli government's going to fly these people to Sudan, or, I think that Indonesia was one of the places where they wanted to remove the Palestinians. It's Egypt, right? It's forced displacement on pain of death or starvation as a prelude to expulsion. And that is basically what it is. Kat's proposal was also rapidly endorsed by Bibi, who instructed the IDF to draw up plans for implementation. Could this happen? Very likely. I would give it probably about a 70% chance, right? Given the way that things are working right now. This idea of a ceasefire that Trump and Steve Witkoff were talking up over the past couple of weeks hasn't gone anywhere, right? Never meant to have gone anywhere. And one of the reasons, of course, is what we've talked about before. One side, Hamas wants a permanent ceasefire. The Israelis just want to rearm and go back in. So, and the Trump administration is completely okay with this. The negotiating theater that we're seeing right now in the Gaza Strip is the same thing that we saw in Iran, same thing we saw with Russia. We'll be talking about that in a second. These aren't real efforts at negotiating, right? Trump is playing his administration is playing all of these different groups. He doesn't want a negotiated settlement with the Gaza Strip. He wants Israel to finish the job. Doesn't want a negotiated settlement with Russia. He wants to continue to encourage and arm Ukraine and keep this war going indefinitely. That basically started under his administration. Didn't start properly under his administration, but he facilitated the start of it, unfortunately. And then with Iran, you have to pay close attention to the language that he uses when he talks about negotiating and then these other countries wanting to talk, right? It's all about ultimatums. He said months ago, relative to Iran, look, no deal. If you want to make a deal, then you got the only deal that's on the table is just getting rid of nuclear enrichment. And when they told him effectively to get lost, that's when he bombs. That's an ultimatum, right? He's going to do what Israel wants with the Gaza Strip, and then he's trying to use an ultimatum right now relative to Russia, and that's not going to work the way it did with Iran. Now, a couple weeks ago, Marco Rubio met with Sergei Lavrov in Malaysia, Kuala Lumpur, and Rubio discussed new ideas for Ukraine peace talks with the Russian foreign minister, while conveying the White House's disappointment and frustration at the intensifying war. And they're always complaining about the war intensifying. But what new ideas are there to discuss? The Russians haven't moved from their positions that they've highlighted time and time again, right? And so what are these talks meant to do? Well, it's theater, right? Because any escalation can be presented as Russian intransigence. The administration can basically say, hey, we're trying to talk to the Russians. Rubio and Witkoff are out there, right? We're trying. They're being intransigent. After a 50-minute conversation with Lavrov on the sidelines of ASEAN, which is the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, forum in Malaysia, Rubio said he would tell President Trump about a new and different approach to peace talks raised in the meeting. I don't think there was a new initiative raised at all. I think that Rubio was basically saying, we'll tell President Trump that you guys are sticking to your demands that you have always had. And the new approach that we need to discuss are sanctions and continuing to arm Ukraine, which we'll get into in just a second. And of course, this exchange underscored the administration's swings between diplomacy and hardline threats. The administration is schizophrenic. It's really difficult for them to just say, look, this is an ultimatum to Russia. They don't have a choice. We want a ceasefire so that President Trump can say that I stopped all the killing. Even if it starts back after his administration, he can at least say, I stopped the killing for a little bit. So Rubio said, we need a roadmap moving forward about how this conflict can conclude. And we shared some ideas about what that might look like. And he declined, of course, to provide details, as is always the case. So all of this is window dressing, and it's a waste of time, honestly. And Trump said on Monday, I think this was last Monday, that the U.S. would resume providing Ukraine with arms after a brief pause. The new weapons deliveries aim to help Ukraine withstand attacks after months of trying without success to draw Moscow into peace talks. And as we'll get into, most of these weapons are defensive weapons, Patriot batteries that are going to be sourced from Europe. And there was a small pause about 2 weeks ago in aid, and it came from the Department of Defense. And Trump, he apparently didn't know anything about it. He said in a conference that I didn't know that I didn't authorize that. Like, well, who's in charge? Who's running the show, man? So he said, I didn't stop it. I didn't think that pause was going to last too long, though. That's how these things usually work. Trump said, we're going to send more weapons. We have to. They have to be able to defend themselves. Just like Israel, they have to be able to defend themselves. And we have to make sure that we give them everything. We have to give them the entire kitchen sink. So much for ending the war in 24 hours. I mean, and that's what he said. You can call it a throwaway line if you want to. But at some point, when you negotiate the end of these conflicts, you have to take into consideration the demands of the other side. You can't have it all your own way. But that's what Trump believes. He believes he can have it all his own way, and that the other country is just going to passively sit down and obey and conform to the wishes of the U.S. Now, Rubio said aid to Kiev continues along the schedule that Congress appropriated. This was under Biden. Dismissing the pause as a short-term measure to review whether it was contributing to Pentagon stockpile shortages. And it likely is. You could look at the move to source Patriot batteries from Europe is a cost-saving measure, even though, putting the onus on NATO, you can look at that as a cost-saving measure if you want to, but the U.S. basically props up NATO. They haven't started giving 5% of their GDP yet to the funds. And so we're still basically paying for those weapons to go over there. You can look at it like, so you can look at it that way and just, be willfully manipulated and say, well, it's not coming from us and it's not costing us, but it is costing us and it is basically coming from us. Or you could look at it like, again, there are shortages going on right now with our military hardware, right? And even if you are to just basically say Europe, just give them everything you have, eventually, with this thinking, you'd have to eventually start providing the Ukrainians with weaponry from our arsenal pretty soon if this war continues indefinitely. It's only so many weapons like this, defensive and offensive weapons like this, that Europe has. So the Russian Foreign Ministry said Rubio and Lavrov had a substantive and frank conversation that touched on Iran and Syria. And so it's very likely that was slightly contentious. They used the word frank, and that's likely an indication that, the Russians voiced disapproval, to say the least, about what transpired in Iran. Rubio last met his Russian counterpart in Riyadh in February, and less than a week later, Trump expressed optimism they were making progress. So this was the meeting that took place in Malaysia. And it was about a week ago between Rubio and Lavrov. And after this meeting, the next steps that were taken, and I'm sure that many of you have probably seen it over the course of the past week, is that Trump is starting the flow of arms again into Ukraine. Now, these or likely, these are basically going to be defensive weapons, Patriots, and they will be supplied directly at the initiative of the Trump administration. This isn't weapons that were already in the pipeline for Ukraine that were approved by Biden. These are weapons approved by Trump and facilitated at Trump's directives. So this is his war now. Like I said, recent deliveries were already scheduled under Biden. And then also, on top of that, Trump has threatened Russia once again with sanctions if it doesn't sign a deal, whatever that looks like, whatever that means, within 50 days. So he's given them 50 days, and if they don't comply with his ultimatum to sign some kind of ceasefire, apparently he's going to screw up the economy more so than it already is by imposing these massive so-called bone-crushing sanctions that have been approved in the Senate. This is a Lindsey Graham sponsored bill, and I think it's like, and we're going to get into some of the details of that right now. So preparations are underway to quickly transfer additional Patriot air defense systems to Ukraine. NATO top military commander Alexis Grinikvich said on Thursday, we'll just call him Alexis, as the country suffers some of the heaviest Russian attacks of the war so far. And they have been under consistent attack. I think last week even, there were like 2 or 3 consecutive days or nights when Russia launched over 500 drones at Ukrainian military infrastructure and civilian infrastructure and this kind of thing. So we are working very closely with the Germans on the Patriot transfer, according to Alexis. The guidance that I've been given has been to move out as quickly as possible. Now, Trump's ultimatum was subsequently rejected when the Russians reviewed some of his outlandish and schizophrenic statements. Russia has rejected President Trump's ultimatum for Moscow to sign a ceasefire deal to end the war in Ukraine within 50 days on Tuesday as unacceptable, calling for continued negotiations and insisting that the invasion ordered by President Putin would continue until its goals are achieved. And we know that Trump and his team don't want to continue negotiating. They don't have the attention span to sit down seriously and have a discussion about the details of what a sustainable ceasefire could look like. And we've talked about all this before, so I won't relitigate it, but I'll just say again that this administration is wanting political victory. It's not about ending the killing. It's not about stopping this war in any sustainable way and finding a resolution that's long term. This is about a PR victory. It's about the idea of once the shooting stops, Trump can declare, I've stopped the killing. And now the Ukrainians can work with the Russians and everything will be great. So in response to President Trump's threat to impose 100% secondary tariffs, and I'm not sure if I'm going to have to look that up. I'm not sure if it's 100%. The Lindsey Graham bill is 500% tariffs. But so in response to Trump's threat to impose 100% tariffs on countries that do business with Russia if Putin's government does not agree to a deal to end the war in the time frame, any attempts to make demands, especially ultimatums, are unacceptable to us, according to Sergei Rybkov. And this was according to the TASS news agency. Sergei goes on and he says, we need to focus on political and diplomatic work. The president of the Russian Federation has repeatedly said that we are ready to negotiate, and the diplomatic path is preferable for us. And just to refresh your memory, they do want to negotiate, but they don't want a ceasefire while they're negotiating. And there are obvious reasons for that. I've went over them in previous videos, but they don't want Ukraine to rearm. They've had these kinds of ceasefires before and they've been broken. So negotiations are preferable to us, says Rybkov. If we cannot achieve our goals through diplomacy, then the SVU or the war in Ukraine will continue. This is an unshakable position. We would like Washington and NATO as a whole to take it with the utmost seriousness. And it would be nice if they would take it seriously and actually put the effort in to get something done in terms of foreign policy, right? There's nothing been accomplished. We've seen the continuation of the massive disaster in the Gaza Strip that Israel is carrying out, pretending that it's about self-defense. We've seen this war that we've started with Iran for absolutely no reason, lying about negotiating or wanting to negotiate, putting on this theater of all these negotiations after the past couple months, then bombing them, not destroying the facilities, their uranium reserves or their capacity to enrich. They've mastered the fuel cycle, and things can be rebuilt. Trump wants to ignore that, so nothing resolved there. And then nothing resolved in Ukraine. And why is this? It's because really, it's kind of in the last sentence of what Sergei Rybkov said. This lack of seriousness on the side of the administration. And so I've shared my thoughts on these things before, and you can really revisit the videos if you'd like, but that should wrap everything up right now. And we'll see you the next time.